Thank you so much for joining us. I am Andrew Culp, the professor of media history and theory in the California Institute of the Arts in the program of aesthetics and politics. You are joining us here for a mini conference that we're holding on the work of R.A. Judy on Sentient Flesh. And the mini conference is 2 sessions that have just followed an incredibly dynamic coffee hour, which unfortunately is why we're running just a little bit late. So thank you so much for your patience. And that coffee hour was really amazing, having global participants from a number of areas and hearing about a number of local conditions, as well as a history of social movements and radical thought in South Africa, which was incredibly thoughtful. This conference has 2 parts. One, a session on flesh, which we're going to be joined with R.A. Judy himself, as well as 2 respondents. And then a second session that we'll ask you to join us here in a couple hours on semiosis and parasemiosis. And this is also part of the winter session proceedings for aesthetics and politics, which is hosting a theorist in residence, Mackenzie Bork, who's given 2 public lectures. The first was on a forthcoming book on Kathy Acker, and the next on the cis gaze and its others, which will be hosted also through this YouTube channel. And then we also would like to thank the School of Critical Studies for their generous support, as well as the Finance Fictions, a working group, because they are helped fund this event. We're quite generous in their proceedings, and I think interacts quite thoughtfully with RA's work on flesh, sentient flesh, and in some ways thinking through the question of commodification, but also an alternative to the commodity in the way in which the flesh, particularly flesh coming through the hold, is a way of rethinking a lot of the assumptions of both political liberalism and its the gaze that it casts, but also Marxist conceptions and Marxist forms of abstraction. So very briefly, let me introduce our speakers. We have R.A. Judy, a professor of critical and cultural studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. He is a member of the Boundary 2 editorial collective, where he edited the 2012 collection of the writings of Tunisian activists, the Tunisian Dossier, as well as a special volume on W.E. Du Bois's Sociological Hesitant. Received an honorary mention in the 2001 Council of Editors of Learned Scholars Best Special Issue Award category. He's published a wide range of scholarship, from Arabic literature and then the Islamic thought to critical race theory and Black studies. He's the author of a groundbreaking book, Disforming the American Canon, and a whole variety of additional essays and other pieces. We're going to be joined today as a respondent with J. Cameron Carter, professor of religious studies at Indiana University Bloomington, who draws on the tools and resources of religious studies, philosophical and political theology, and aesthetics. And he works in Black studies with an attention to the theory and practice of Blackness. More specifically, his research concerns what he calls the distant sacred, or the fugitive sacrality that is internal to Black social life. The author of Race, Theological Account, The Religion of Whiteness, forthcoming. Additionally, recently in the process of completing a book manuscript, Black Rapture, a Poetics of the Sacred. And finally, we're also joined by Franco Barchesi, an associate professor in comparative studies and the Department of African American and African Studies at Ohio State. He's taught at the University of Wits in Johannesburg and the University of Bologna and Brooklyn College. He's a former Larry Donnell Andrews Fellow at the Hutchins Center of African American Research at Harvard, and currently a senior editor of the journal International Labor and Working Class History. His latest book, Precarious Liberation, is a recipient of the CLR James Award for the Working Class Studies Association. He's currently working on 2 book projects, one theorizing precarity through Black radical theories and engagements with the implications of wage labor and racial domination and anti-Blackness, and the other studying how the connections between wage labor and anti-Black violence are constitutionally defined through the transatlantic slave space of the 19th and 20th centuries. So without any further ado, I invite R.A. Judy to present from his absolutely monumental work.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to begin by thanking again Andrew for putting this together and organizing it so quite wonderfully, and thank for conceiving it, and thank Caltech for hosting this event. I've been asked today to speak about and read from my most recent book, Sentient Flesh. And I've been asked to sort of jump into the weeds, as it were, and to give you a reading from a particular passage. And that passage is the passage that's in the chapter Sentient Flesh. I'm going to do as I'm asked, because that's kind of my nature. But it's a difficult task, given that the way in which this book is composed and conceived, there's a very specific attention to a rhythmic attitude, and I mean indeed to invoke Xii's notion of that, as well as Frantz Fanon's. Of course, disavowing altogether the former's ethnobiologism and embracing completely the Fanonian concept of attitude rythmique, a particular kind of perpetual radical orientation. And so this was a book that really was composed with rhythmic attitude, and indeed a polyrhythmic attitude. So reading a passage in isolation can produce some dissonance and disorientation. And to make that dissonance work, I'm going to read in montage. I'm going to read paratactically, which is pretty much how the book itself is conceived. And hopefully in conversation, any lacuna or aporia that present themselves can be addressed. So let me jump in. And I will not more than 30 minutes, if that, because I want to really hear from all of you. An ontologically discordant being. I was 21 years old, war was settled. My mother and grandmother kept my age up, and after the death of them, I know how to handle it myself. My old master's name was pretty fair to his darkies. He gave him plenty to eat and wear. I was born and raised in Indian Territory and emigrated from there to Atlanta, Georgia. I was about 12 or 13. We lived right in Atlanta. I cleaned up around the house. Yes, ma'am, that's what I followed. When the Yankees came to Atlanta, they forced us into the Army. After I got in the Army and got used to it, it was fun. Just like meat and bread. Yankees treated me good. I was sorry when it broke up. When the bugle blowed, we knowed our business. Sometimes the age I is now, I wish I was in it. Father Abraham Lincoln was our president. I know the war was to free the colored folks. I run away from my white folks is how come I was in the Yankee Army. Before the war, my white folks was good with us. I had a better time than I got now. My father and mother was sold away from me, but old Mr. didn't rest without him and went and got him back. They stayed right there till they died. Us folks was treated well. I think we should have liberty because us ain't hogs or horses. Us is human flesh. Now, the most remarkable thing about this passage, taken from the 3-page typewritten transcript of an interview with the 92-year-old freedman, Tom Wyndham, is his rather offhanded statement at the end. We should have our liberty because us is human flesh. Wyndham's interview, conducted by Bernice Bowden in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, sometime in 1937, is one of 696 done in that state over a 2-year period under the agencies of the Works Progress Administration, Federal Writers Project, 670 of which were submitted to the WPA Writers Unit of the Library of Congress to be eventually compiled for archiving, along with those of 16 other participating states, into the 17-volume Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States, from interviews with former slaves. Claiming the human entitlement of freedom is not at all extraordinary in the context of the WPA project mandate, which was to record the experiences and memories of those who had endured enslavement before they passed away. It is noteworthy that throughout the period when these interviews were conducted, from 1937 to August 1939, there was a sharp recession precipitated by Federal Reserve monetary policy, prolonging the worst effects of the Great Depression, which for poor Black folk like Wyndham resulted in amplified peonage and forced labor under incarceration. Given that immediate context, claims of deserving freedom, attended by comparisons with the conditions of antebellum slavery, were par for the course throughout the entire interview qua narrative collection. But be that as it may, the interview protocols made all the more remarkable Wyndham's asserting humanity as a predicate of the flesh rather than a condition of being beyond the flesh. Those protocols were set out in a 20-item questionnaire prepared by John Avery Lomax as supplementary instructions to the American Guide Manual, which all WPA interviewers were to follow. Composed in his capacity as national advisor on folklore ways for the Federal Writers Project, Lomax's agenda with the questionnaire was to establish some uniformity of method across the project's 17 state offices, where the majority of field interviewers not only were white and so often inclined to color the respondent statements according to their own racial biases, but were also ignorant of interview techniques or otherwise inattentive to the issues of distortion inherent in the interview process that those techniques were to correct. There was more to it than that, however. Uniformity in method of collecting and recording the material was crucial to ensuring archival integrity of the final collection, and Lomax was an expert collector. His endeavors between 1907 and 1910, culminating in cowboy songs and other frontier ballads, was instrumental in developing the methodology for collecting American folk song and establishing its study as a main constitutive element of national heritage. A student of the renowned Harvard English literature scholar and American folklorist, George Lyman Kettridge, from whom he acquired a philological attitude toward culture, Lomax defined folk song as the intimate poetic and musical expression of unlettered people, not yet contaminated by the social transformations of industrial modernization, such as rapid urbanization, commercialized popular culture. In accord with the tenets of earlier collections of American folklore, such as Cecil Sharp and Franz Boas, held that such folk songs were the artifice of communities isolated from mainstream American life. Lomax went further, however, maintaining that communities, the population was entirely Black, or plantations were in number, the Negroes greatly exceeded the whites, as in the Mississippi Delta, yielded specimens of Negro songs that in musical phrasing and in poetic content are most unlike those of the white race, the least contaminated by white influence or by modern Negro jazz. Southern penitentiaries and prison camps provided for Lomax the fertile field for collecting authentic specimens of Negro songs, to stick with the designation of the moment, because of the extremity of their enforced isolation. And as he explained to Carl Engel, chief of the Library of Congress Division for Music, under whose auspices, with funding from the Council of Learned Societies, he had embarked in 1903 on his first photographic expedition through Texas prison farms, Negro songs, in much of their primitive purity, can be obtained primarily as nowhere else from Negro prisons in state and federal, Negro prisoners, in state and federal penitentiaries. Here, the Negro are completely segregated and have no familiar contact with the whites. Thrown on their own resources for entertainment, they still sing, especially the long-term prisoners, who have been confined for years and who have not yet been influenced by jazz and the radio, the distinctive old-time Negro melodies. The main objective of this and subsequent expeditions to prisons and isolated rural communities throughout the South was to record the in situ performance of such authentic Negro artifice. And this is precisely what Lomax sought to collect: an accutate phonographic disc for categorization and preservation at the Library of Congress's Archive of American Song, where Lomax had been appointed honorary consultant and curator. Phonographic disc displays field notebook as the recording media in those expeditions, being immediately archivable without needing a decipherment or editing. It freed the collector from absolute reliance on musical notation and lyric translation as the principal form of preservation. Even so, Lomax's in-field recordings from musical performances to interviews entailed transcribing observed events in the context of which He often set up in pursuit of a particular type of specimen, his collection in a way resonant with Adorno's characterization of Walter Benjamin's flânerie. Indeed, his procedure was very to that of a collector on the hunt, particularly poignant illustration of which is provided in the 1940 recording session with Wild Willie McTell in Atlanta, Georgia. In the interview Lomax conducted during the session, he presses McTell to perform "Ain't It Hard to Be a Nigger, Nigger?" as a specimen of what he calls complaining. In requesting this particular song as a specimen of that typological designation, Lomax was directing the session to support the thesis of his 1947 Nation article, Self-Pity in Negro Folk Songs, in which he lays out a topical typology of Negro singing, from spirituals to postbellum secular forms. The article begins with a flat-out assertion, stated as a simple matter of fact. A Negro singing the folk songs of his race might be termed a Negro thinking out loud. The Negro really drops into original composition, or at any rate, original additions to the song he is singing. Situating this thinking with music in the overall typology of American folk song, Lomax does not find it to be unique of the Negro, yet the way the Negro does it is quite distinctive. The Negro minstrel is preeminent both in musical ability and in easy assimilation and imitation of food. Thus his song becomes a sort of soliloquy, fitted to melody and rhythm. The time and the tune seem to take care of themselves, adapting themselves easily to words which the singer repeats one or perhaps many times until memory, or as often some whim of his emotion, supplies another line or so to continue work with. And working thus through a medium of which he is master, his unrestricted thought flows out through his singing, and fitting itself into the rhythmic motions of manual labor, or to the unhurried pace of his progress along the street, to the relaxed mood of his little porch at twilight, he thus soliloquizes in song and reveals the emotion of his race with a unique, ingenious. Lomax is picking up here a line of writing about Negro singing as the musical expression of thought, first laid down by Frederick Douglass in his 1845 narrative. In the rather well-known closing paragraphs of chapter 2, Douglass describes slaves' spontaneous singing in the course of doing a regular chore, going to the great house farm, their designation for the Lloyd plantation, to receive their monthly allowance. They would the dense woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy and the deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consult the time nor tune. The thought that came up came out, if not in the word, in the sound, and as frequently in the one as in the other. Let's give careful consideration to this line of Douglass's, attending to how it flows into Lomax's depiction of Negro song. Having described the slave singing as spontaneous expression of thought in word and sound, Douglass proceeds to give what is arguably the first published formal analysis of the oxymoronic character of the relation between lyric and music in Negro song, challenging the then prevalent construal of their lyrics as fundamentally incomprehensible. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. Into all of their songs would weave something of the great house farm. Especially would they do this when leaving home. They would then sing most exultingly the following words: "On away to the great house farm, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh." This they would sing as a chorus to words which to many would seem unmeaning, but which nevertheless were full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. Nor is Douglass being sentimental when he then states, "The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. I have frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to those songs, even now, afflicts me. And while I'm writing these lines, an expression of feeling has already found its way down my cheek. Rather, he is exhibiting how the thinking expressed in this singing, not so much non-conceptual as it derives concept from affect, which is underscored by his immediately claiming, to those songs, trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. I could never get rid of that conception. Presenting hearing the singing as one of the pivotal moments in his own awareness of the brutality of slavery. He then proclaims in what is rightly taken as a call to action. If anyone wishes to be impressed with the soul-killing effects of slavery, let him go to Colonel Lloyd's plantation, and on allowance day place himself in the deep woods, and there let him in silence analyze the sounds that shall pass through the chambers of his soul. And if he is not thus impressed, it will be because there is no flesh in his abjurant heart. 10 years later, in his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass elaborates his formal description of the songs, adding to their notes, were not always merry because they were wild. On the contrary, they were mostly of a plaintive cast and told a great tale of grief and sorrow. His description of the song's oxymoronic character is abbreviated. In the most boisterous outbursts of rapturous sentiment, there is ever a tinge of deep melancholy. Still, Douglass emphasizes the affective grounds of conception by changing the identity of those likely to be impressed at merely hearing the songs from some minds to truly spiritual-minded men and women, with reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject becoming readings of whole volumes of its mere physical cruelties, and adding, they speak to the heart and to the soul of thought. Accordingly, the call on those who would wish to gain a full sense of the oppressive force of slavery to, in silence, analyze the sounds the slaves at Colonel Lloyd's plantation make on allowance day is mottoed to, in silence, thoughtfully analyze sounds. It is the response to that call, albeit delayed, which carries Douglass's line further into what will become the field of African folklore where we encounter Lomax. Cut, second montage. Just to say in passing, of course, that line goes to Lucy McKim, who first transcribed spirituals in 1861 and 62, and of course to William Francis Allen's famous book on Negro spirituals. And from there we go on into Lomax. Now, with all this in mind, returning our focus at this point to the remarkable thing about the passage from Wyndham's interview, it is easy to see how closely Bowden was adhering to the Lomax questionnaire, with its underlying conceptualization of Negro artifice as a valuable primitive specimen. Still, his remark, us as humans, even granting Lomax's admonition to allow the interview subject to depart from the suggested line of questioning and to follow wherever he or she pleases to go, challenges not only the premise of the entire WPA interview project about what and how the Negro is, it also challenges the more general premises about the nature of freedom and humanity. It does so by being discordant with the ontological grounds on which these things stand. Hence, a discrepant taxonomy. In making his remark, Wyndham evokes a taxonomy of flesh, encompassing a range of animal life, more precisely hogs, horses, and humans, all of which, in strictly zoological terms, belong to the class of vertebrate, cortical, eutherian mammals. His privative ain't introduces a subdivision within that zoological class along the lines of a punctual continuum of sentience that moves from the basic to complex. On the one hand, there is the vital biological commonality of animal flesh, which may be sentient in a rudimentary sense of having the capacity to perceive and respond to the environment sufficiently enough to live actively, the reflex of perception, cognizance, and behavioral response, without any signs of self-awareness or having psychological states, something we ascribe to hogs and horses. On the other hand, there is the manifest self-aware possession of psychological states and of being in relation to others and other things that is associated with. In this sense, the ain't makes Wyndham's taxonomy one of sentient flesh, drawing a distinction between zoology and anthropology. Us ain't hogs or horses. Us is human flesh. Of course, the full force of his privative is directed at another, albeit related, taxonomy, the political economy of modern capitalist slavery, within which Wyndham as a Negro slave belongs, along with hogs and horses, to the class of chattel property. In that political economic taxonomy, the flesh is valued for what it can produce in asset. This is a matter of speculation as much as it is of consumption in use. And in that regard, asserting us is human flesh acknowledges the vital biological quality, the form of life, while rejecting evaluation as chattel. What distinguishes human flesh from other flesh is the inalienable entitlement to liberty, to be owned by no one, or to again be a bit more precise, the capacity to express that entitlement propositionally as communicative action. We should have our liberty because us ain't hogs or horses. Us is human flesh. There's a third montage, but I'm going to abbreviate it and skip over because I only want to speak for 5 more minutes so that we can talk and we can go back over it. And that montage is marking the ways in which Wyndham's remark echoes a statement made by Frederick Douglass, and how that statement about hogs and horses and slaves itself echoing the language of slave codes that we find from 1662 in Virginia, all into the 19th century, in which Negro slaves are categorized expressly as property, as real estate, we could say. And while it makes that connection that Wyndham is echoing Douglass, it points out how Douglass's investment is still very much the investment in the Enlightenment conceptualized person. And that investment is predicated upon a distinction between body and soul, which Wyndham's remark departs completely. So then I will jump to the fourth montage. This is what happens when you skip over something you've written. By still adhering to the proposition of natural personhood, Douglass maintains the right of the person, irrespective of the body, which may or not be dismembered, tortured, and redistributed. Having played along Douglass's line then, getting to here, Wyndham's "we should have our liberty cause us as human flesh" is not, as first seen, a iteration on Douglass, but rather a riff on the same legal code, or at least the commonplace practice authorized by the code to which Douglass alludes. Compared to Douglass's horses, sheep, swine, and men trope, however, Wyndham's "we should have our liberty cause us as human flesh" strikes another altogether more strident note of discord with Lockean natural rights theory, postulating it is the person of, not in the flesh, who has inviolable rights. An additionally noteworthy detail of Wyndham's assertion in this regard is the complete absence of any theological reference. Entitlement to liberty is based on divine endowment or any other claim of transcendent purpose, nor even on providential or evolutionary teleology. It simply is a fact of the very nature of human flesh. And so his privative rebuts the market evaluation without appealing to transcendence. Lacking as it does even a residual trace of the transcendent postulate, Wyndham's "us is human flesh" moves us away from the theological as well as the metaphysical tendency of thought, the tendency to think the I falls into the world of things, having its reality beyond them. Perhaps this is why Saidiya Hartman takes up Wyndham's remark to be emblematic of the basic assertion of colored folks' entitlement to freedom, she writes, glossing it to interpolate the underlying position. The flesh, existence defined at its most elemental level, alone entitled one to liberty. This interpolation is recognizably an invocation of Hortense Spiller's extended exploration of the relationship between flesh and persona, keeping in mind that persona connotes a determinate discursive sociality rather than a state of nature. Some of these Spillers has been carrying out through a series of studies that focus on the issue of the Black woman's embodiment in an effort to reimagine the question of community without adhering to the long-standing tradition of positing the rift between animality and generative intelligence, requisite for human society. With that exploration, we may well ask, what does it mean, however, to flesh alone, as existence defined at its most elemental level, entitles one to liberty? What is the relationship between flesh and one? Is one predicable of flesh, or is flesh a predicate of the one? Thank you.
Absolutely remarkable way into the text, which, if people haven't had an opportunity to read yet, is quite extensive. It's a work of incredible brilliance, and you can tell it took a lot of time and patience. And one thing that we're getting with you speaking, RA, is its virtuosic nature, in which it reads out loud actually quite beautifully. So thank you so much for this wonderful beginning to the conversation. And I'd like to next invite Franco Barchesi to give his initial remarks, which will then be followed by J. Cameron Carter. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Professor Judy, for this extremely thought-provoking presentation from what is really a dazzling book. I can't find another word right now, because yes, I mean, I think in the vastness of its theoretical and conceptual vista, as well as its erudition, Sentient Flesh is a dazzling book. I mean, one would be tempted almost to say that it is a book that contains multitudes, if it wasn't for the fact that Walt Whitman, who uttered the word contains multitudes, perhaps reflects precisely the type of humanist ontological project that Professor Judy quite rightfully criticizes. So let's just say then that one ends reading Sentient Flesh with the sense that the conceptual and programmatic coordinates of a multitude of disciplinary discourses have been profoundly unsettled by this book. Now, on many of these unsettled terrains, I am not really qualified to comment. Therefore, these brief remarks will focus on Sentient Flesh's disforming of political theory, to recall the title of Professor Judy's earlier work, especially his book, Disforming the American Canon, including the duality of this, which comes in brackets, as the unmaking and the remaking of a set of questions in political theory. In particular, Sentient Flesh disforms the ways in which political theory has got used to think its own grounding in forms of life. Such grounding, Professor Judy shows, simply cannot let go of ontology. Ontology in the sense of pronouncements over the essential or existential significance of human existence. Ontology either as an explicit commitment or ultimately, at the very least, a very effective temptation that continues to work even in the case of a range of critical approaches that claim to be para-ontological, beyond ontology, or even anti-ontological, and how this entire grounding of political theory in forms of life really cannot let go of ontology, even when it is uttered in the form of critique of ontology. Sentient Flesh presents itself and works quite effectively as a mode of what in the book is called poiēsis in black and thinking in chaos, two terms that are quite closely connected. And as poiēsis in black and thinking in chaos, Sentient Flesh not only proclaims the irrelevance of ontology to black being, an irrelevance that is expressed also quite poetically, literally, as a flying away of black being from ontology, but also demonstrates how such irrelevance has been determined by black thought in action as it makes the interlocutory life of ontology and its own critiques and overcomings not so much a target of critique, but something ultimately not worth investing in, either intellectually, politically, or affectively. Sentient Flesh, in the sense of Tom Wyndham's As is Human Flesh, expresses in a very theoretically profound yet very matter-of-fact way, or as Professor Judy just said, a very offhanded way, it expresses the subversive potentialities emanating from the antagonistic positioning of black existence, antagonistic in the sense of an irreconcilable and exceeding incompatibility and excess of black existence as life in the flesh or of the flesh, and how that is antagonistically incomparable with a range of ontological or para-ontological projects that are invested not in the human flesh, but in the human bodies with or without organs, one is tempted to add. Human bodies that are prerequisites and outcomes of self-possession, self-mastery, coherence. The us in Wyndham's statement reflects, rather than inscription in generic human coherence and relationality, what Professor Judy terms black poiēsis, a disruptive and disrupted non-relation between blackness and world. Black poiēsis appears as, in the book's own words, a flight away from the modern philosophical project that one might call transcendental poiēsis, as a relation between the human subject and the world, whereby the world is the stage for a self-conscious fulfillment of capacities and potentialities. This is an ontological project that, in spite of its Hegelian matrix, remains quite powerful in shaping a range of diverse critical discourses and the very coalitional imagination of resistance that informs social movement politics, for example, or activist discourse today. In fact, I would insist on looking at ontology, a term that in the book takes different meanings as the book traces the very development of ontology as a notion from an ancient idea of writing about the existence of being toward a more modern idea of writing about the essence of being. But I would rather take the book also conveys an idea of ontology not only as a project, as a philosophical project, but as an expression, an expression that I borrow from Frank Wilderson here, as a type of interlocutory life. Ontology is a type of interlocutory life, which includes, therefore, anti-ontological critiques or para-ontological critiques that really remain attached to the idea of improving ontology, improving an ontological analytic, for example, by making it more attuned to practical experience, or I would add, as in much current neo-Spinozianism, ground ontology in becoming, in human becoming, or, and I quote from the book here, try to ground ontology in, and I quote at page 325, irreflexive trans-individual structure. These are all attempts that present themselves as para-ontological or even anti-ontological critique, but simply cannot let go of ontology and find their place of enunciation in the interlocutory life of ontology. At the same time, while powerfully declaring that Black poiēsis has more important things to do than tearing with ontology and para-ontological critique, Sentient Flesh also conveys, I think, a sense that ontology maintains a constitutive relationship with anti-blackness, or that anti-blackness plays a constitutive role in the concerns that animate the interlocutory life of modern ontology, especially. A constitutive relationship between ontology and anti-blackness that is especially manifest in the semiotic and imaginative machinations with which, and this is really one of the breathtaking parts in the book, the semiotic and imaginative machinations with which the Negro is turned into an object of myth, and how myth is a way of appropriating the flesh while disavowing its meaning and its antagonisms. The Negro becomes myth, Professor Judy shows in his critique of Heidegger's representation of Africanness, or the ethnologist's elaboration of the oral histories of the enslaved, precisely when an onto-epistemic desire to appropriate, to categorize, to systematize, make intelligible Black existence confronts its ultimate opacity, in relation to which both philosophy and the social sciences are dumbfounded. Another expression quite powerful in the book, used in the book. One is then drawn toward wondering what motivates such ontological mandates. What motivates such ontological mandates to mythically theorize Blackness within categories of humanity that stand apart and against sentient flesh? Ontology is, the book convincingly shows, unprepared to deal with Black thinking in and of chaos. And I quote here, and yet ontology wants to have the last word, so to speak, trying to turn chaos into something productive along the coordinates of human subjectivity. Ontology seems to be terrified and attracted to chaos at the same, terrified by and attracted to chaos at the same time, in ways that I think resonate with, and here I follow Lyndon Barrett's reading of Hegel's philosophy of history. I mean, it resonates with the ways in which Hegel's excision of Africa from history is in fact the condition for the very possibility of philosophizing history as the opposite of what is in fact being excised. Or more generally, opacity and absence act not only as limitations on theory, but as conditions for enunciating what counts as theory. In this case, what semiotized elements digested into myth of Black existence can be made to work for the purpose of human rejuvenation. The book's critique of myth as an ultimately impossible yet normatively productive attempt to make Blackness legible through ontology, made me think of Edward Glissant's point, which also in Caribbean Discourse, which also emanates from a Black critique of myth and its complex connections to narrating history with the capital H, as Glissant writes, against which Glissant posits the Caribbean folk tale. Glissant writes in Caribbean Discourse that, and I quote here, "The forest of the Maroon was thus the first obstacle that the slave opposed to the transparency of the planter." The forest of the Maroon was thus the first obstacle that the slave opposed to the transparency of the planter. If the elusiveness of sentient flesh stands to ontology in a comparable untransparency, then the questions raised by the book would also include whether ontology and para-ontology, as conjugated also in registers like governance or even resistance, are also modes of capture, are also modes of capturing through a mode of legibility what is elusive because illegible, and it maintains its subversive potential precisely in that elusiveness and illegibility. And if Black poiēsis, like Glissant's metaphorical, I guess, forest, leads to constantly eluding that capture, I am wondering, in conclusion, and here, I am aware that addressing this may not be a major concern in the book. It's just it is just something I'm wondering about. I am wondering if Black poiēsis is this kind of illusion and constant flight. What would happen when ontology finds out? Will its fear, to quote from Fanon, fill the world as much as when the world is about to find out what the Black is up to, or if not fill the world, at least will the ontology spheres fill, at the very least, the academia as a particular terrain in the world? Will ontology, therefore, will ontology sphere fill the world, or at least the academic world, once it finds out what Black poiēsis is up to? And what then? Thank you.
Thank you, Franco. Thank you very much. Mille grazie.
Prego.
Yes, thank you so much, Franco, for your very incisive comments on quite an important debate right now in Black study and the thoughts surrounding it on the precise role of ontology, but how it informs life, philosophies of life and thinking, and the very careful thread that Professor Judy pulls through the book. So to move next to Jay, who I know, whose remarks then open up to a conversation that I'll invite all three speakers to then sort of build to a conversation as a group. Thank you.
Greetings. I'm going to begin by first of all expressing my deep gratitude to Professor Judy for this stellar piece of work for thought. I sort of engage this book in terms of an ongoing conversation. I kind of keep going back to it and dipping in and then taking it in, and then it drives me back. So I'm grateful for Professor Judy producing precisely this kind of work that is to be understood, as he's already said, rhythmically, or perhaps we can put it in similar terms, musically. That is to say, the book itself is structured and imagined almost like a piece of music, set one and set two, the theme of set one, the theme of set two, and then the chapters themselves being visitations upon that theme, a kind of spinning within that theme, and then a further spinning within that theme with each turn and twerk and torquing of its theme. New vistas then open up, again, somewhat like the engagement with a musical piece. So this is all to say and to express my gratitude for this kind of work and for this work of thought, and the gift that it is to certainly me and those of us gathered here and others beyond those who have convened here. I also want to express my gratitude for Professor Franco Barchesi's fine comments, and already having touched upon in your comments, Professor Barchesi, the kinds of things that this text has me thinking very, very deeply about. I'm trained on the one hand, and began my intellectual scholarly itinerary with questions of theology being quite paramount. And those questions are still there, but I've kind of turned in many respects to questioning the ways in which the theological in relationship to the ontological has done much kind of anti-Black work. And so in revisiting the pages of the chapter on flesh, body and flesh and so forth, I've again been struck by the degree to which I take this text itself to, in its critique of ontology, to also be leveling a certain kind of critique of ontology's relationship to theology, or we might say the ontotheological. Where Professor Judy ended his reading, I believe your fourth montage reading is a page that I have quite marked up in my copy, because again, just to point back to the lines in question, you explicitly bring up the theological. You say, talking about Douglas and his own kind of the kind of ongoing kind of enlightenment kind of imaginary in Douglas, you say the following: compared to Douglas's horses, sheep, swine, and men trope, however, Wyndham's "we should have our liberty cause us is human flesh" strikes an altogether more strident note of discord with Lockean natural rights theory, postulating it is the person of, not in, the flesh who has inviolable rights. And additionally, noteworthy detail in Wyndham's assertion in this regard, you've already read this, but it's worth bearing in mind again, in this regard, is the complete absence of any theological reference. Entitlement to liberty is not based on divine endowment or any other claim of transcendent purpose, nor even on providential or evolutionary teleology. It simply is a fact of the very nature of human flesh, lacking as it does even a residual trace of the transcendent postulate. Wyndham's "us as human flesh" moves away from the theological as well as the metaphysical tendency of thought, the tendency to think the I that falls into the world. And that phrase, "that falls into the world," is kind of, for me at least, echoes Fanon echoing himself Césaire about the kind of fall into a certain condition, but that also registers for me another kind of theological discourse or doctrinal theme of the fall, right? The lapsarian condition. And again, I take it that Professor Judy's work is pressing back against even that as well. So to go back and complete the sentence without the breaks, Wyndham's "us as human flesh" moves away from the theological as well as the metaphysical tendency of thought, the tendency to think the I that falls into the world of things, having its reality beyond them. And the whole point, or at least one significant point that I take it that Professor Judy is making about Sentient Flesh, is that it doesn't have its kind of condition of meaning by way of a kind of theological ascription to it beyond flesh in its own right, flesh as such. I think this is very, very important. And from there, you stopped your reading, but from there, the next section of the chapter, a semiosis of flesh thinking, is this beautiful and very careful, in fact, it goes from there to the end of the chapter, I take it, this beautiful and careful reading of Spiller's statement, before the body, there is the flesh, and reading it in terms of a kind of engagement with Roland Barthes' thinking on myth, the way in which Spiller's is in so many words, kind of rereading Roland Barthes in some sense against himself, but then Judy is coming along and pressing even more inside of that kind of space that Spiller starts to open up. And at this point, it sort of like confirms, as I hear Professor Barchesi, it confirms this point about the centrality of myth, the mythifying of the Negro, and what, shall we say, gets eaten up in the production of the myth of the Negro, right? And to think in many respects beyond that mythification. And so in many respects, the book itself, in thinking the sentience of flesh, as sentient flesh, is thinking on one level as a critique of the mythological, itself a critique of the ontotheological, and in that critique, shall we say, thinking what is already, shall we say, beyond, flying past the mythological, the ontotheological. Now, the question, one of the questions that I have in, I think I broached this, I might have broached this in my email, in one of my emails to Professor Judy, is again, how this relates to what Spiller's also in Black, White, and in Color, the essays collected there in a number of places, especially, beginning with the first chapter of that book, Ellison's Usable Past, and then the subtitle is Toward a Theory of Myth. This early 1978, work, piece of writing in which Spiller's reflects on the work of Ralph Ellison that Ralph Ellison is doing in Invisible Man, and reads Invisible Man, reads Ellison's story as itself trying to lay out the terms of the mythification of the Negro, and how there's another horizon to that book, which she calls the counter myth. And I take it that the counter myth is already pointing towards, shall we say, flesh that is sentient and outside of the kind of precincts, not fully, shall we say, gobbled up, eaten up by the ontotheological sort of like kind of conditions of racial capitalist commodification. So my interest, my question is, one, is this a way to put together what Spiller's also calls counter myth with the practice of parasemiosis, right? Am I reading, is my reading and my engagement with Sentient Flesh, properly speaking, then a certain kind of critique of the slave ship itself and the transubstantiation work that the slave ship is doing? It will try to gobble up sentient flesh, and on the other end, out comes the Negro, thus making the slave ship something like a kind of political, theological, or ontotheological political vessel. Is the critique of parasemiosis is both the critique of the mythification of the Negro from the hold of the ship, and then at the same time from the hold of the ship, a kind of thinking of what does not get gobbled up, shall we say, and that which survives and passes through the hold of the ship to engage and enact all kinds of alternative passages and practices at the crossroads. Is this also a way of thinking the counter mythic that Spiller's also brings up? In my mind, I want to think those things together. I want to sort of think about parasemiosis and sentient flesh and the practices of the crossroads as that which exceeds Negrofication, which is to say mythification, and therefore that which is, shall we say, counter mythic against the myth of Negro mythification. All of this is a way to ask the question about, is it a fair way to read this book as itself, the critique of political theology and an understanding of racial capitalist practice, right? Middle Passage itself as a terrain, a kind of sacramental baptismal terrain on the one hand, and the ship itself as a kind of political theological vessel. And what exceeds what is carried in the hold of the slave ship as a kind of mythifying practice. That excess itself as a parasemiosis, and therefore as kind of, shall we say, counter mythic. So I'm going to stop there and just sort of like say that at the heart of my comments is the degree to which my reading and engagement with Sentient Flesh as itself a certain kind of critique of mythification of the Negro, but that mythification is a theological production. And therefore, parasemiosis is that work that is on the far side of the theological as ontotheological production of the Negro.
Thank you so much, Professor Carter, for your incredibly incisive remarks. So at this time, I'm going to invite all three speakers to take up these questions and develop it in conversation. So back to you all.
Let me say again to both of you, thank you for really generous and truly insightful readings. I've taken a number of notes. I can only say that it's gratifying to be able to be in conversation. It's gratifying to get any sense that one's effort to contribute to the conversation works. And yes, Professor Cameron, I mean, it's there in the preparatory remarks, the preliminary map. This is a polyrhythmic book, and when initially it was conceived with Helen Carter before she tragically passed, and what she insisted on in original conceptualizations was that I not lose sight of the investment in rhythm and the experiment of trying to sustain polyrhythm across a number of pages. I mean, it comes to mind a conversation that I was recently involved in with Fred Moten about this in his wonderful book, All That Beauty, right? Where he recalls the let's say the difference or the variation between Thelonious Monk and Ornette Coleman, right? In which Thelonious, for problematical reasons, belittled Ornette Coleman for not being able to follow chord changes and for not being able to have complicated rhythmic structures. Of course, he was wrong, and the interesting part of that story is what his heir points to as a problem of political philosophy and political thinking. But rhythm is what's at stake. Musicality is what's at stake. And in that respect, when I say it's good to be in a conversation, what I really am saying is it's good to be able to jam with you guys. It's good to be in a band that keeps growing. And in a band whose capacity to jam relies on, and I always have a problem with this term, but I'll borrow it from you, Franco, the veracity of all the players. So I want to thank you that these readings have in their own right been extremely full of virtuosity. Without, I might add, being romantic. So I guess I'll make some substantive remarks of engagement that hopefully can move us along. Franco, you and Cameron both have grasped the central question around myth, and if I can say mythos in the text. And it's an engagement on a number of fronts, but two of them I want to point to, which both of you remarked. The one front, Jay, you remarked in talking about this section on horse, is with respect to Roland Barthes and the ways in which his engagement with mythology was his effort to reveal the mythification at work in advertising in popular culture. And in so doing, being able to free it up for a particular kind of political analysis, which he, of course, took to be a Marxist, let's say leftist political analysis. And yet my point in following Hortense's careful following of that is while that argument about myth, and of course Barthes argues you can't escape myth, right? You can't escape the process of mythification. Not even the effort to produce French free verse is going to escape this, right? It's somehow fundamental to the constitution of the polity of our moment. So in his effort to offer this critique, the grounds he stands on, the critical grounds he stands on, I want to show are even more problematic. And those are the grounds of phenomenology, where he wants to have this hard distinction between the processes of mythification, which are semiological, they're semiotics, right? And something else that's going on there. And I show this in his reading of Bichon chez les Nègres, Bichon among the Blacks, and also his reading of the Paris Match photo of the young boy saluting. And in his investment in that distinction, right? In other words, his ability to critique mythology or mythification is predicated upon the implicit presumption that there's an order of knowing that's phenomenological. Right? And we're slipping back into the terms that Kant laid out for us. He posits there's something called the Negro. Le fait de nègre, right? And I want to trouble that. And why do I want to trouble it? Because what's interesting in Barthes' critique or engagement with mythification, and this will take me into the second aspect of critique that you were pointing out, Franco, is that it reveals the power, the force of mythos, of narrativizing, right? In the sense that the ancient talk about it, or Aristotle specifically would talk about it, right? And making it one of the constitutive features or elements of poiēsis, of poetry. And in that moment of revealing it, which is what Hortense shows us, and this is what allows her to go into her notion of vestibularity through her use of Barthes, it becomes possible to think about what it is to put the world together on grounds other than the phenomenological. And of course, what's at stake there is precisely all the things you pointed out, Franco, and that's the extent to which the phenomenological as a philosophical attitude is predicated on a very particular investment in ontology as a specific project, right? So it gets. So there's this moment in Barthes where it's possible to see a way out that he shuts down, right? And he shuts down because of investment in the fact of the Negro, the phenomenological fact of the Negro, right? And that's his acknowledgement of city, but in a way quite different from what Glissant means when he says our right to our opacity, right? A way much more akin to Heidegger's that you, Franco, in that opacity is the forest, the metaphoric forest, which becomes then for Bach and for the ontological project an excuse to not think differently, right? Oh, we can't get through that forest. Oh, we can acknowledge it's there. It's phenomenally there. It's full of mystery, right? It's of the order of, as I lay out in the book, of the fetish. And that's a thing those people do, right? Stake in that gesture is precisely the maintaining of the old discourse of political thinking and of political organization, which is indeed indicated upon a certain, more often than not, unexpressed understanding of the human, right? And an understanding which is grounded in a very particular discourse of transcendence. Now, the second aspect of myth that's at play there, the one that, Franco, you were touching upon, precisely Aristotle. Precisely that moment in which what's at stake there is Aristotle recognizes the force of mythos, the force of the generation of meaning in the working of language, the force of poiēsis, and he understands it in the same way that Plato had understood it. And he understands the perpetual tendency towards disorder entailed in that, right? That it cannot be ultimately controlled, cannot be fully circumscribed, and hence cannot be fully brought into management of the mean that he talks about, which he understands to be the ideal structure of the state. So he has to domesticate, and I'm using that term very deliberately, right? Thinking of his notion of economia, right? And why I'm thinking of that is because, of course, in Aristotle's effort to arrive at the ideal state of equals, can be no despotism. The one place there is a necessary despotism is the domestic space, right? That's the place where, in order for that free man who can participate in the agora to be so, he has to be despotes. He has to be the despot, right? In his relationship with those other creatures, the women, the children, and the slaves, right? So he domesticates mythos in his poetics. He does this fully in keeping with what Plato had done before him, and then elaborating it with his very particular phenomenological approach. And so he does this by saying that there's one particular discourse of the possible discourses that can outperform mythos in its capacity of not only representation, representing the world, its capacity for what he calls mimesis, but can outstrip it by being able to explain its workings, right? And that is the apophantic discourse, the discourse of what he will call his episteme, right? What he will call his, and we can perhaps talk about it in the second session, because that's part of the passage that I want to read there as well, that distinction he wants to make between episteme, that's science, and technike, which is what's at stake, of course, in his famous remark about art imitates nature. So that is the other aspect of myth I'm concerned with, right? Trying to show the equity of this need to domesticate it. And what's at stake in that domestication is not merely philosophies repressing poetry, but philosophies telling a particular kind of tale about the capacities of semiosis, right? And a tale that works in accordance with a very specific binary, hierarchical binary. Certain semiosis is superior to all others, right? And to one of your fundamental questions, Marco, this is the perennial problem that's within the ontological project that the opacity of blackness points out. And that is the compulsion of that project to look at being qua being that requires this binary hierarchy, right? And whenever it encounters a set of events or phenomena understood in its own terms that are not readily subsumable to its grammar, it has to exert violence. And that violence becomes a greater exercising of its taxonomic powers, right? And that's what I characterize as the orientation towards exterminism that is constitutive of that particular philological project, right? And we can talk about this in all kinds of different ways in which it gets expressed explicitly. We find this in Francis Bacon's Nouveau Organum, his new corpus. We find it in Atlantis. We find this in Descartes, the proposition that this mind that now is free from the divine is going to master nature. And I want to characterize that as an attitude of extermination, that mastery means extermination, which of course I play with in the questions of Bach, which I revisit later on in the text when we talk about the limitations of the paraontological and why, as I say, us ain't paraontological, that drive to master is the drive to kill, right? It is fundamentally eschatological, right? So that the most positive gesture can only be the gesture that brings about the end of things, in the fullest sense. A couple more things then I want to hear from you guys. And I've already begun to address one of them, Franco, and that's, I loved your question about what happened when ontology figures out what the Black is doing, right? Will it fill the world with fear? Well, what I just said about this problem is precisely it's driven by fear and filling the world with fear. The question I want to ask is whether or not that's still a viable project. And I want to ask this along Fanonian lines, which is that I want to ask it as an historical problem as well as a political one, right? And I mean, Fanon's remarking that the days of the European project are over with, and he's of course speaking to his fellow African brothers. What we have to worry about, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that we don't repeat those stories, right? Our challenge at this moment is to think something else, to recognize the moment, and to engage in that thinking of something else, and not follow a dead end, right? Not become involved in the path of the living dead. So I think that the question of, will it fill the world with fear? I want to change to, well, is it capable of filling the world with fear? Right? And it's a serious question. It may be. I think we have to ask this because part of the conversation we were having during the coffee clutch that was interesting is how in South Africa, we have a wonderful moment we need to study of the risk of that discourse of death, that eschatology reasserting itself, right, in the name of various forms of liberation, right, various forms of progress. To be provocative, I would say we saw evidence of that in the events of yesterday in the United States, right, where there's this reassertion of eschatology as salvation, right, this discourse of unity. So when I say, can it still do this? This is a real historical question, right? This is to underscore the moment of we're in, or the moment of possibilities we're in, right? And whether we can take them. Yes, indeed, I am engaging Hortense's long engagement with Ellison on these questions, and I want to clearly, instead of counter myth, I talk about parasemiosis, deliberately instead of counter myth, right? Because again, what I'm after is an attentiveness to the generative force of mythos, of semiosis, right? And whether we can think about semiosis in a way that is hierarchical, simply put, right? And I'll talk about that later on when I talk about what's at stake, para, and the para semiosis. So thank you. Those are my initial responses to these really quite fruitful remarks, which will probably go into, I presume, a second edition, in addition to fixing the many typos and corrections in this one. These things, your remarks will be factored in as well. You guys are supposed to talk now. But you have to unmute to talk. Don't tell me I've silenced you. Franco, please do not be dumbstruck.
I am. I mean, but I also wanted to some extent. I mean, I'm still processing the responses to my. But Jay, if you want to go ahead, otherwise, I mean, I can't. Something is coming to my mind. I mean, on the question of, I think, I mean, all I can say is that for now is that on the question of whether it is a viable project to confront the ontological project in terms of that kind of unflinching critique. Well, I think Ray, if I may call you, so if I can address you, like kind of your comments provide an answer to that very question. In fact, they indicate that not only it is a viable project, but it is sort of necessary precisely on account of what seems to be at stake here. In other words, I mean, especially in relation to what you were saying before about the deep connection between ontology and extermination as ontology's weapon of last resort, one might say, for those who try to signify their existence on their own terms after the existence of the other, and I would say black existence has been posited as generative, but only on condition that it is not signified in blackness's own terms. I mean, that alone is what makes that kind of confrontation with ontology as a project necessary. I mean, at least ethically. I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer write that Kantian rationalism, and one might say Kantian kind of own ontology, is unable to provide a rational argument against murder. I mean, here I think we are beyond that. I mean, we are exploring what is a deep connection between ontology and violence that sustains this world's very ability to reproduce itself by making difference manageable in discursive, mythical, and policy terms. So I think if this is what we're talking about, if this is like if these are the ontological foundation of this world and the question that it allows to be publicly discussed, then yes, I mean, I think it is more than viable. It is necessary to confront that. As to what the response can be, well, I mean, as you're saying, I mean, I agree with that. We are seeing it in these days, and at a far lower level of abstraction. I mean, than grand questions about what are the ontological foundations of existence. I don't have a conclusive answer as to whether it is capable to fill the world with fear. It definitely has to do so. Rhetorical, philosophical, and I'm afraid practical, institutional even.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it has an internal capacity, and I push a bit on Adorno and Horkheimer's assessment, which I, of course, share. Not only is the Kantian project incapable of providing a rational argument against murder, it very actively provides a rational argument for murder.
For murder, yes.
And including the annihilation of the planet.
Yeah.
When I say whether or not it can still fill the world with fear, it's my gesturing to the fact that as Lyotard diagnosed almost 40 years ago now, yes, La Condition Postmoderne, that he wrote for the Canadian government, there's been a proliferation of narratives, a proliferation of stories, of semiosis. It's a fact. And whether or not the ontological project can master all of them, can still contain them, I think that's the contestation. And so, yes, there's a need for me, not so much critique, but for a flying away from it, recognizing that because it is so fundamentally violent and destructive, that we need to simply do something else. And we need to recognize that we don't have to try to redeem it, which is my point about the critiques. We can't, I don't know if there's anything redeemable in that aspect of the philosophical project. And then I'll say one more thing, because you said something that really struck me. It's really quite important. This is indeed the political question. And the relationship between ontology and myth is bound up with the political question in a very specific way. This is the question of our understanding of this fundamental concept of sovereignty, which is under a great deal of pressure right now. And I want to add to that pressure on the concept of popular sovereignty. And I'm going to say that what we see in events that have taken place in the past 10 years in Tunisia and in Egypt and even in Libya and in Algeria and in Sudan most recently, and it's also now going on in Niger and in Senegal, is the actualization of what was previously itself a kind of metaphor or myth of the popular sovereignty. Of the people as sovereign, which was generated in the English Civil War to serve bourgeois interests. We're seeing a moment now in which the people are actually expressing some sense of self-capacity, right? Mediated self-capacity. And that's marking a potential fissure, a rift, a break, which is one of the reasons why I think a great deal of resources and energy are being spent to curtail, to suppress those possibilities around those movements. Right? And I'm talking about institutional interventions in places like Tunisia and Algeria, discussions, the recognition, for example, of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, which really is an abomination. The current discourse to delegitimate any radical critique and to acquaint white supremacists with Black Lives Matter. All of those are signs of a danger that these moments pose, which are a sign of perhaps the limitations of the ontological project to unquestioningly or unchallengingly fill the world with fear.
I'm wondering if you could, I know you're going to talk about this in the next section of this conversation at 20 minutes or so, whenever it begins, but I still wonder if you might say a little bit to it now. I am interested in the relationship between parasemiosis and counter myth. Would you say something about along those lines?
Yeah. Rather than countering the dominant myth, and rather than taking a position of opposition, I am conceiving of parasemiosis as a performative modality, which in its movement, in its dynamics, is appositional. So it's a movement of confluences in which there can be the articulation of multiple stories, if you will, multiple mythos, some of which can be in tremendous contestation with one another, others of which there can be certain parallelisms, but not solutions. To put it just very simply, I take parasemiosis to be blues. And countermyth to being new age electronic music. And in the sense that the former blues is, and here I follow Ellison and Albert Murray, oxymoronic. Right? It's at the crossroads, and there's all kinds of motifs of this concept of a modality of being that's at the crossroads, that's in confluence, right? And not in opposition. So it's not about being counter myth, right? It's about a multiplicitous mythology that's at work. Now, one of the issues there is a difference, if you will, of perspective, right? One of my investments in parasemiosis is a kind of, this is a term I will disown immediately upon using it because it's inadequate, internationalism, right? The question, as I try in the coda of the book, is not to have another story of Black American exceptionalism, which means trying to arrive at a way of thinking and doing things that is on different bases than the bases of Black Americanism, which are still grounded in the ontological in a certain sense, right? Where the issue is a dialogue and interlocution. How do you say it, Franco? Interlocutory life.
Interlocutory life, yeah.
Interlocutory life, right? Which is the life between, the Black and the white, right? The myth and its counter, the familiar dialectic, the thesis and its antithesis. So parasemiosis is wanting to move in a way that's completely apositional to all of that. So it's not a question of theses, antithesis, of position and counter. It's a question of how can we be together,
right?
Common in movement. Okay? So it may be a failed attempt on my part, but an attempt on my part to think differently. not merely to have a different critique of the same thing, but to think differently about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a ways in which Hortense and I are thinking somewhat different.
Mm-hmm.
More, you'll have to wait until 12 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
Or a little after 12 because we're running over.
And I can see that, I mean, truly what is at stake is the political at this point. I mean, insofar as the mythification of the Negro is itself constitutive of a certain modality of the political that is under critique in your work, which then means we would need to reconceive then, we'd have to think politicality apart from the ontological and ontotheological terms in which it's been embedded.
And there's a whole bunch that follows from that. A whole bunch of things are put up in the air in play. Indigenismo, indigeneity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nationalism,
Yes.
essentialism, certain notions of the diasporic.
Yeah.
I'm trying to approach something like what Lisson talks about, réalisation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That itself is it's already the alternate. It's an alternate imaginary then of the political as such.
Well, Lamming calls it the radical imagination.
Right.
Perhaps this is a great moment to put a pause on this conversation. It's been so fruitful, engaging, provocative. You know, I'm reminded of the centuries or millennia of even the question of how do we begin thinking, let alone extend or even apply. And it's already being interlaced with so many important pressing issues, from contemporary events in the present to long and deep histories and things on the level of metaphysical schema all the way to immediate and deep and violent and intractable conflict. And so I think these are precisely the sort of questions that require sitting with, and that conversations like this give us the opportunity to even begin developing how to take another step. So perhaps everyone in the audience can join me in thanking Professors Judy, Carter, and Barchesi for their remarkable remarks and even just starting to unfold the conversation. And I invite people to remain in touch with these incredible thinkers, to search out their work, build it in conversation, reach out to them, see other opportunities for them to speak, and perhaps be in conversation with them yourself, because there's just so much fruitful content here to deal with what seem to be the paramount issues, not only of our time, but for a very long time. So there's going to be a short break in the conference, and then we'll return in about 20 to 30 minutes to have Professor Judy hosted in conversation with the artist, curator, and writer, Aria Dean. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation, and I look forward. Question?
Thank you.
Yeah, for clarification. Are we starting at 12:30 instead of 12 o'clock?
It will be 11 o'clock my time, which I believe is 2 o'clock your time.
Yeah, all right. I meant to say 2:30 instead of 2 o'clock.
Oh, we might be able to delay things 15 minutes as well if you want a more ample break. I know that we've been at this for a while, and I can just put up an announcement on our page to let.
No, I'm fine to come back at 2 o'clock. I just wanted to make it clear
Okay.
for everyone,
That's
including
good.
the audience. All right,
Yeah.
so I'll see you in 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Just wanted to make sure, in addition to our thoughtful existence, that your biological existence is always taken care of here. Need to move around.
I don't even. Are we still streaming?
We are streaming, so, but I'll probably cut this out in the final edit as well.
Okay. Well, no.
Wonderful.
Once you stop streaming, I'd like to say something, Franco, and to you before you guys go.
Excellent. So let me stop